How long did people actually sleep in the Middle Ages? Well, first of all, there is no way that we can know exactly how much sleep people averaged in the Middle Ages. Most of what we think about sleep today comes from the 19th century, when a French doctor named Nathaniel Kleitman developed the first scientific study of sleep. And he basically said that adults should sleep 7 to 8 hours a night, which has been the standard forever since. However, not everyone sleeps that much, and it's generally agreed upon now that sleeping more or less than that is healthy. So sleep experts say that people don't need to sleep a set number of hours per night, but rather that they need to get a certain amount of rest. The idea being that if you feel rested during the day, then you're getting enough sleep. And so with that in mind, we can look at sleeping habits of the past, not in terms of how many hours people slept, but how well rested they were. And even still, trying to figure out how well rested people were in the past is pretty tricky, because usually the only records we have are from the wealthy who could afford to keep a diary or hire a scribe to record their daily activities. So just like when we talk about diet in the Middle Ages, and we have to focus mainly on the diets of the elite, here too, we will be focusing mostly on the sleeping habits of the rich, which may or may not be indicative of everyone else. But hopefully, it gives us some clues as to what the commoners were doing. With all that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into the topic of sleep in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, the length of a person's day was not measured in hours, but in natural cycles of daylight and darkness. So medieval people awoke at dawn, which would often be around 4 a.m, and went to bed at dusk, which would be around 7 or 8 p.m., giving them about 15 hours awake in a 16-hour day. This meant that they slept roughly 8 hours a night, which seems pretty close to the recommended amount today. So far, so good. However, the quality of those sleep hours varied widely depending on the season. During the winter months, shorter days meant that people were going to bed earlier and waking up later, meaning that they got more sleep overall. On the flip side, during the summer months, longer days meant that people were up earlier and staying up later, meaning that they got less sleep. While this isn't ideal, humans have been dealing with seasonal changes in sleep schedules for thousands of years. In fact, it wasn't until the advent of artificial lighting that we were able to stay up late and wake up early regardless of the season. But even though these extra hours might seem like a luxury, for most people in the Middle Ages, life was just too chaotic to allow for decent sleep, even if they wanted it. For example, there was a balding epidemic in the Middle Ages, likely due to rampant syphilis, which left men desperate to cover up their bald spots. And so to deal with this problem, they wore elaborate wigs made from animal skins that were sewn together to form a cap. This process took hours over the course of several days, and then the finished product had to be worn everywhere until it fell apart. So you can imagine that making and wearing these things couldn't have been done while the wearer was asleep. Similarly, women in the Middle Ages wore elaborate dresses with long, tight sleeves that were also difficult to put on and take off. And so again, sleep was impossible while wearing these garments. So it was generally understood that sleep needed to come before other parts of your day, whenever that was possible. As for those hours spent not sleeping, they were generally split between work, which would take up about 6 hours, and leisure, which would take up 5 hours. During the remaining 4 hours, people would take care of household matters such as cooking, cleaning, bathing, dressing, etc. And this is where sleep becomes complicated. Because, for example, while we generally associate bathing with cleanliness, in the Middle Ages, baths were associated with sexual activity and thus were reserved for special occasions. Rather, bathing in the Middle Ages was something that you did in a communal bathhouse, and it was something that you did fully clothed. In fact, the water wasn't even hot. It was just slightly warmer than room temperature, and the whole experience was more about socializing than it was about hygiene. And so while bathing did take up an hour of a medieval person's time, it wasn't exactly relaxing. Similarly, eating took up 2 hours each day, but not for the reason you might expect. That's because in the Middle Ages, meals weren't necessarily seen as a time to relax and enjoy food. Instead, meals were a time to get as much food as possible inside you, because food was scarce and expensive. Therefore, breakfast consisted of whatever was left over from the previous night's dinner. Lunch was bread dipped into wine, and dinner was whatever cheap ingredients could be found that day. It was only after the Black Death, when labor shortages caused food prices to plummet, and people had money to spend, that eating became a leisure activity. Finally, there were the 5 hours of leisure time. Theoretically, these hours could be spent doing whatever you wanted, and they certainly were. But in practice, these hours were often spent working on church-related tasks, such as praying or reading religious texts, which took up 3 hours. That only leaves 2 hours for fun, which is probably more than some of us have. So how does all of this add up? While medieval peasants and elites alike spent about 1/3 of their lives asleep, the quality of that sleep varied wildly depending on the time of year, access to luxury items, and whether or not a plague was sweeping through town. Ultimately, it was often difficult for people in the Middle Ages to get a full night's sleep, and the hours they spent awake were filled with obligations and chores. But maybe that's part of why medieval art and literature is so obsessed with dreams. If you couldn't get a good night's sleep, then maybe the next best thing was to spend your nights sleeping in a dream. Okay, so I tried to pick an obscure topic for this week's episode. It's 2 a.m. Are you up? Well, if you were alive in the Middle Ages, you'd probably be up anyway. But how long did people sleep back then? More or less than us. And how was it even possible for anyone to get any shut-eye with all those pesky peasants trying to murder you in your sleep? We sent our intrepid reporter back in time with a pillowcase full of garlic to find out. So let's keep drifting. Because medieval sleep wasn't just about how long. It was about how strangely people managed to complicate bedtime. Let's start with pajamas, or more accurately, the lack of them. Peasants usually just wore whatever they already had on. Clothes doubled as blankets, and blankets doubled as everything else. The wealthy had nightshirts and floppy nightcaps. They looked practical, sure, but also like Santa Claus after a rough day. So if you imagine medieval lords slipping into elegant silk robes before bed, no, think wrinkled linen sacks, smelly wool, and greasy hair. Then there's hygiene, which, honestly, barely existed. Nobody brushed their teeth before bed. Toothbrushes didn't show up in Europe until much later. At best, someone might chew on a stick or swish wine around in their mouth. Baths? Rare? Sheets? Washed a few times a year, if that. Beds where valuable peasants actually listed mattresses in their wills, as if they were priceless heirlooms. Imagine inheriting your uncle's lumpy straw sack. Now let's talk about bed sharing, because privacy was basically non-existent. Families often slept together in the same bed, or even with animals in the winter, since cows were the original space heaters. At inns, travelers had to share beds with strangers. Picture finishing a long day's ride and ending up spooning a farmer you just met. Cozy. Even kings didn't always sleep alone. Attendants often slept nearby, ready to fetch wine if His Majesty got thirsty at 3 a.m. Religion, of course, had opinions. Sermons warned against oversleeping. It was considered sloth. But undersleeping wasn't great either, because neglecting your body was a sin too. Basically, whatever you did, someone thought you were wrong. Monks had the hardest time. They followed strict prayer schedules. Waking at midnight, 3 a.m. dawn. Their sleep was a patchwork mess, which was considered holy, but also exhausting. Now for something surprisingly modern. Medieval people understood, in their own way, seasonal sleep. In summer, people often managed 5 or 6 hours because sunrise meant chores. In winter, though, they could spend 12 or more hours in bed. Not all of that was deep sleep, sometimes just lying awake, whispering, praying, or shivering under a pile of blankets. In short, hibernation. Oh, and dreams mattered too. People thought they were messages from God, demons, or maybe just the questionable stew they ate for dinner. Dream manuals explained every symbol. Falling meant bad luck, animals were ominous, even treasure dreams spelled trouble. So a nightmare wasn't just a bad dream, it was practically a supernatural event. Some people sprinkled holy water on their beds or kept knives under their pillows, because nothing says restful slumber like hugging a dagger. So, how long did medieval people sleep? The short answer: more hours than us, but rarely all at once. They lived by first sleep and second sleep, with a midnight pause in between. Beds were crowded, hygiene was questionable, and pajamas were basically oversized potato sacks. Not glamorous, not cozy, but it worked. And honestly, the idea of waking at midnight, sitting by the fire, whispering with your spouse, or just feeding the animals, it sounds peaceful. If you ignore the fleas. So if you find yourself awake at 2 a.m. tonight, don't panic. Just remember, you're not broken. You're basically medieval. All you're missing is a cow snoring in the corner. Good night.
When you think of life in the Middle Ages, you probably picture knights in armor, dragons and damsels in distress. But what about nighttime routines? How did people wash themselves? What kinds of beds did they sleep in? And most importantly, how long did people actually sleep in the Middle Ages? What? Let's keep gliding deeper into medieval nights. We've talked about segmented sleep, scratchy nightshirts, and people clutching daggers under their pillows. But bedtime wasn't just about how you slept. It was also about where. So let's start with beds themselves. Now, if you're picturing a nice fluffy mattress, just stop. For most peasants, the bed was a wooden frame stuffed with straw, leaves, or sometimes just leaves. The kind of support system that gave you a bad back before you even turned 30. And you didn't just get new stuffing every season. You added to it more straw, more reeds, more whatever you could find. By the time you finally replaced the thing, it was practically compost dog cozy. But here's the fun part. Even these humble straw mattresses were valuable. Peasants often listed them in wills. Yes, imagine spending your whole life working the fields, and your legacy is one lumpy mattress. Medieval inheritance was glamorous. Meanwhile, in castles, beds were a home production. The wealthy had massive carved wooden frames for posters and heavy curtains. The curtains weren't just decorative. They kept out drafts in icy stone rooms, muffled noise, and added privacy. Privacy not just from servants, but also from assassins. Because nothing says sleep tight like the possibility of someone sneaking into your room with a dagger. Beds were so expensive that they were passed down through generations, sometimes worth more than jewels. In fact, giving someone a bed was a serious gift. Forget diamonds. Nothing said I care about you like offering a second-hand mattress filled with medieval dust mites. And beyond comfort, beds were political. Monarchs actually held audiences in them. Ambassadors were received while kings lounged under their bed curtains, maybe half-dressed, casually sipping wine. Because nothing commands respect like a ruler who can't be bothered to get out of bed. Now, let's drift to the sleeping spaces themselves. Peasant cottages were usually one room, maybe two if you were lucky. Families, servants, kids, animals all sleeping in the same space. The line between bedroom and barn was fuzzy, privacy, basically non-existent. Inns were even worse. Travelers shared not just rooms but beds. Yes, random strangers spooning at medieval motels. Snoring, coughing, lice-sharing strangers. It was less sweet dreams and more hope you survive until morning. Castles, though, were drafty nightmares of their own. Huge stone walls, freezing air, and open fireplaces that fill rooms with smoke. That's why noble beds had all those curtains. They were basically indoor tents. Without them, you'd wake up as an ice sculpture. Now, let's drift to the sleeping spaces themselves. Peasant cottages were usually one room, maybe two if you were lucky. Families, servants, kids, animals all sleeping in the same space. The line between bedroom and barn was fuzzy. Privacy basically non-existent. Inns were even worse. Travelers shared not just rooms but beds. Yes, random strangers spooning at medieval motels, snoring, coughing, lice-sharing strangers. It was less sweet dreams and more hope you survive until morning. Castles, though, were drafty nightmares of their own. Huge stone walls, freezing air, and open fireplaces that filled rooms with smoke. That's why noble beds had all those curtains. They were basically indoor tents. Without them, you'd wake up as a nice sculpture. But what was the medieval night actually like? Well, loud, very loud. Forget the idea of peaceful silence. You'd hear animals constantly cow-shifting, pigs grunting, dogs barking at shadows. Roosters didn't politely wait for a sunrise. They crowed whenever they felt like it. Add in the creak of timber, the scratching of rats in the walls, the occasional drunk stumbling home from the tavern. Medieval nights were more chaotic than common. And of course, there was fear. Night-time was dangerous. Darkness meant thieves, bandits, or worse things people believed lurked in the shadows, witches, ghosts, demons. Whole communities genuinely thought that evil wandered freely after sunset, which might explain why so many people kept candles burning longer than they should have, despite the fire risk. Imagine lying awake, listening to every creak, clutching your little night knife, wondering if it's just the wind or a demon. Sleep tight. Now, here's a small but fascinating detail. Who slept when? Not everyone went to bed at the same time. Servants stayed up later, finishing chores by candlelight. Nobles might stretch evenings with feasts, gossip, or music. Monks, as we know, had schedules more complicated than any modern sleep coach. And peasants, of course, went to bed early because daylight was precious and candles were expensive. So in one village, at any given hour of the night, you'd find a strange patchwork of activity. A family stirring during the gap between first and second sleep. A servant sneaking scraps from the kitchen. A monk trudging to prayer. And someone, always awake by the fire, poking at the embers to keep the cold away. So, to sum up this little drift through medieval bedrooms, beds were treasures, curtains were fortresses, cottages were crowded, castles were freezing, inns were sketchy, and the night was noisy. Crowded, and if you believed the folklore, absolutely crawling with demons. But people slept anyway, in twos, rounds, with interruptions, in company, under straw or velvet, in fear or in war. Somehow, despite the fleas, the rats, and the drafty stone castles, they managed to drift off. Which proves once again that humans can and will fall asleep anywhere, under almost any conditions. So next time you complain about your mattress or your noisy neighbors, just remember, at least you are not sharing a straw bed with your entire family and 3 chickens. At least your headboard isn't a political stage. And at least you don't have to fend off assassins while wearing a floppy linen nightcap. Now close your eyes. Picture the fire fading low, the curtains drawn tight, and the sound of a medieval village settling into an easy sleep. Not perfect, not private, Not even especially clean, but somehow. Enough. Good night, and thank you for watching. From all adventures through history's bedrooms. Stay tuned. We've got more sleep stories to tell, from ancient Egypt to Victorian England. Plus, we're answering your questions about the weird ways our ancestors hid the hay. Send your ideas to the email below. And meanwhile, dream of brave knights battling not just dragons, but also their reaching nightshades. Until next time, sleep well. Because things could be so much worse. Your mattress could be full of straw, for starters.